Have you ever seen someone take a step so uncertain, so shaky that it made the entire room fall silent? Imagine a young boy whose feet won't listen to him, struggling to move, yet daring to step forward. This moment wasn't about perfect rhythm. It was about courage. If you believe that true leadership comes from trust and the willingness to follow, hit that subscribe button and join us as we dive into this powerful journey. Haimey Voss sat motionless at table 5, his small hands clasped tightly on his lap. The soft glow of candlelight flickered across his pale face, but his eyes were fixed elsewhere. Not on the food before him, nor the clinking silverware, nor the elegant chatter of the restaurant's guests. His gaze was drawn, as always, to the dance floor, a small stretch of polished hardwood between tables where couples swayed gently to the smooth melodies of a live jazz trio. His legs felt like dead weight under the tablecloth, each muscle a reminder of how they didn't quite obey him. He wanted to join them, to feel the rhythm in his bones, to be part of something, anything that made him feel normal. But his body betrayed him at every step. It wasn't the first time. When he was younger, he fell in the middle of a crowded museum, the laughter of strangers echoing in his ears long after he hit the ground. Not cruel laughter, just the kind that comes naturally when someone does something out of place. That sound had dug itself deep into Haimey's soul, and it never really left. Now, even as he sat at a table in a quiet upscale restaurant, the weight of those stares followed him like a shadow. He didn't want to look at anyone. He didn't want them to see him. But the music, the soft waltz in the air, pulled at him, and he longed to feel a part of it. His father, Haimey Voss, sat across from him, stone-faced as always. The billionaire real estate tycoon was a man of control. He had mastered his own world, shaping cities with his wealth and his iron will. But Haimey was a different story. His son, the fragile one, the one whose body wouldn't listen. Harlan tried in his own way to protect him, to shelter him from the world's harshness. He always kept Haimey close. Too close, perhaps, shielded from the laughter, the ridicule, the stares. "Don't look at them, Haimey," Harlan would say. His voice low but firm, a shield that both comforted and trapped. But the more Harlan tried to protect, the more Haimey felt like a prisoner in his own body, unable to break free from the expectations of those around him. Tonight, as Harlan sat in silence, barely touching his food, Haimey's eyes wandered across the room watching couples drift in a slow dance. There was something about it, something so simple, so free, that tugged at him, yearning to be a part of it. He felt the trembling in his legs, a familiar fear creeping up his spine. But tonight something was different. Something inside him, some quiet whisper that had been growing louder over the years, urged him to stand. For the first time in a long time, Haimey didn't wait for permission. He didn't ask his father for help. He didn't even look at him. He simply stood, his legs shook, his balance unsteady. His breath caught in his throat, but he didn't falter. He couldn't. Not now. With a slow, tentative movement, he turned toward the waitress, Clara. Her name tag caught the light, Clara Shaw, and her brown hair was pulled back neatly in a bun. She moved gracefully between tables, her tray balanced. Effortlessly in one hand, her soft smile a quiet mask of practiced calm. But something caught Haimey's eye. It wasn't her tray. It wasn't the way she moved through the room. It was the way she walked. There was a rhythm to her steps, a quiet grace that Haimey recognized. He saw it in the way she held herself, the way her feet barely seemed to touch the floor. With a slight hesitation, he reached out. His arm trembled as he extended his hand toward her, fingers splayed in a silent invitation. His voice barely a whisper, he asked, "Do you still dance?" Clara paused. She hadn't been asked that question in years. She crouched down beside the table, lowering herself to his level. Her eyes softened as she looked at him, and a smile tugged gently at the corner of her lips. "Only when someone dares to lead," she said, her voice warm, carrying a promise of something unspoken. Haimey didn't wait. His heart pounded in his chest, and with an unsteady breath, he placed his small hand in hers. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath with him. There was no spotlight, no dramatic pause. Just a boy, a waitress, and a dance that wasn't meant to be perfect. Clara didn't move at first. She didn't pull him into a graceful spin. She simply stood there, her hand in his, waiting for him to lead. And then Haimey took that first step. His feet shuffled forward, hesitant, trembling. He didn't know the rhythm. He didn't even know the steps, but he moved. Clara, ever so gentle, moved with him. She didn't try to fix him. She didn't lead him or correct his faltering steps. She simply followed. In that moment, something shifted. The entire room seemed to stop. The murmurs of conversation faded. The clink of silverware dulled. And for just a moment, there was only Haimey and Clara moving slowly together, each step a declaration of courage, of trust. Haimey stumbled, his foot scraping awkwardly across the floor. He froze, embarrassed, shoulders rising toward his ears. But Clara didn't flinch. She smiled at him, small but real, and shifted her weight to match his. She didn't rush to steady him. She didn't pull him back into line. She simply stayed with him, and that was all Haimey needed. His next step came easier. It wasn't perfect, but it was his. And for the first time in his life, Haimey wasn't just following. He was leading. As the music played softly around them, the world seemed to change. The laughter didn't grow louder, but it lingered, uncertain at the edge of the room. The eyes of the other diners flickered toward them, drawn by the quiet defiance in Haimey's movements. But no one spoke. No one laughed. Instead, they watched as a boy with uncertain feet led the way, not with perfect rhythm, but with the simple act of moving forward. And in that moment, Haimey wasn't the boy who couldn't walk. He was the one who dared to take the lead. And Clara, she wasn't just a waitress. She was the one who chose to trust him, to follow him without question, without hesitation. The room held its breath, and so did Harlan. For the first time in years, his son wasn't just standing still. He was moving. And in that movement, Harlan realized something he'd never allowed himself to see. Haimey didn't need him to lead. He needed him to follow. The weight of that realization hit Harlan like a wave. His legs twitched, wanting to move, to step forward, to stop this moment before it could go any further. But something inside him, something deeper, stopped him. For once, he didn't want to intervene. He just watched. The sound of clinking silverware slowly returned to the room, the gentle murmur of conversation creeping back. But for Haimey Voss, everything felt muffled, as though the world around him had grown distant, and all that remained was his son and Clara, still moving together on the floor. Harlan's eyes were locked on them, but his mind was somewhere else entirely, wrestling with a sudden, unfamiliar turmoil. He had never felt more conflicted in his life. It wasn't just the sight of his son taking a step, his step, but the way everyone in the room seemed to pause, as if in reverence, as if they had witnessed something sacred. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, leaving him breathless. The chaos of his thoughts was interrupted only by the distant sound of a soft cough, a small, barely perceptible sound from behind him. Harlan turned slightly, just enough to catch the eye of a familiar face. Frank, the restaurant's owner. Frank had been the Voss family's neighbor for years, and more than once Harlan had attended business dinners here, discussing properties and deals. But tonight, the usual lightness of their interactions seemed to be gone. Frank's gaze, locked on the dance floor, held a deeper understanding, one that Harlan wasn't prepared for. Frank stood near the entrance to the kitchen, arms crossed, a furrow in his brow. He was an older man, graying hair and tired eyes, the kind of person who had seen more than his fair share of the world's disappointments. But there was something about Frank's look, a mix of concern and something else, that struck Harlan in an unexpected way. Frank hadn't said a word, but his eyes followed the movements of Haimey and Clara intently, his lips pressed in a thin line. Harlan, caught in his own whirlpool of conflicting emotions, knew Frank was watching him, waiting for him to do something. But for the first time, Harlan didn't know what to do. Should he step forward? Should he intervene? His protective instincts flared, but something in his gut told him this wasn't about protection. This was about something else. A soft sigh escaped Frank's lips and he finally spoke, his voice low but heavy with the weight of years of experience. "You know, Harlan," he began, his words cutting through the stillness, "sometimes what we think is protection, it's really just control. And control, it can be a cage, not a shield." Harlan's chest tightened. He didn't answer immediately, his eyes still glued to his son. Haimey, his small frame trembling with every step, was still moving with Clara. She hadn't corrected him, hadn't tried to smooth out the awkwardness of his dance. She was simply there, present. In the moments when Haimey wobbled, Clara absorbed his unsteady movements, shifting with him, trusting him to lead. The contrast between Haimey's determined steps and the stillness of the rest of the room hit Harlan like a physical blow. His mind raced, flashing back to every moment he had hovered over Haimey, every decision he'd made to keep him safe, every instance when he'd shielded his son from the world. All those moments, every time he'd told Haimey to stay back, stay in the corner, stay where it was safe, came flooding back, each one a reminder of how much control he had tried to maintain. Frank's voice brought him back to the present. "You've kept him close, Harlan. Too close, but Haimey, he needs more than that. He needs you to let go, just a little." Harlan's throat tightened, his fists clenching involuntarily. "Let go?" he repeated, his voice almost a whisper. "I've done nothing but protect him. I'm doing what's best for him." Frank tilted his head, his eyes softening with the kind of understanding that only someone who had lived through the pain of loss and growth could possess. "Harlan," he said quietly, "you're doing what you think is best. But what's best isn't always what we think. Sometimes letting them fall is what helps them rise." Harlan felt a lump form in his throat. He had always believed that protecting his son meant holding him back from the world's dangers. He had always been the one to fix things, to make the decisions, to control the circumstances. But now, as he watched Haimey take another shaky step, moving away from him, away from the safety he had tried so hard to provide, Harlan's world felt like it was collapsing. In that quiet, tense moment, Frank's words echoed in his mind. Letting them fall is what helps them rise. The weight of those words sank deep into Harlan's chest. He realized now that Haimey wasn't just trying to walk. He was trying to lead. And Harlan, the one who had always been in control, was now faced with the hardest lesson of all. That sometimes the hardest thing a parent can do is step back and let their child take the lead. A chill ran down Harlan's spine, not from fear of losing control, but from the realization that this was no longer about him. It was about Haimey. The boy who had always been afraid of falling. The boy who, for the first time in his life, was finding the courage to move forward on his own. The dance floor, once a place of discomfort, now felt like the most important space in the room. Harlan's gaze flickered back to his son. Haimey had stumbled again, his foot dragging awkwardly behind him. But Clara didn't hesitate. She just let him move at his own pace. And Haimey, despite the uncertainty, was still leading. Frank's voice interrupted his thoughts again. "I know it's hard," he said quietly, "but sometimes the best way to protect them is to trust them." Harlan stood frozen for a moment longer, the weight of the choice pressing down on him. The air was thick with the tension of what was happening before him. His son stepping into the world on his own terms, no longer a child, but a person with his own rhythm, his own pace and his own path. For the first time in years, Harlan wasn't sure if he was the one holding Haimey back, or if it was the other way around. And in that moment, he realized that he wasn't just watching his son take a step, he was learning to take one himself. Harlan stood at the edge of the dining room, barely aware of the soft murmur of conversation rising around him. His eyes were fixed on his son, who, with each uncertain step, seemed to break free from something Harlan had fought so hard to build. It was as if the walls Harlan had carefully constructed around his son were crumbling right before his eyes. The moment stretched, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Harlan couldn't breathe. His instinct was to rush forward, to shield Haimey, to hold him back from what might happen next. What if he fell again? What if the laughter returned? What if the world was too harsh for him? These thoughts tore at him like a storm, every wave, pulling him further away from the reality unfolding before him. Haimey was leading now, every hesitant step a statement of his quiet rebellion. He was no longer the fragile boy who needed protection. He was the one moving forward, even if it wasn't graceful, even if it wasn't perfect. And Clara? Clara was still with him. She hadn't corrected him. She hadn't intervened. She was just there, mirroring his movements, not in a way that tried to fix him, but in a way that trusted him. It was a delicate balance, a dance, not of rhythm, but of trust. Suddenly, a loud laugh from a nearby table pierced the air, breaking the fragile tension that had hung so quietly between Haimey and Clara. It was soft, but unmistakable. Harlan's head whipped toward the sound. It wasn't loud enough to be malicious, but the sharpness of it cut through the room. It was the laugh of someone who didn't understand, someone who didn't see. A man at the far end of the room, dressed in a suit a few sizes too large, had dropped his napkin and looked up, still chuckling under his breath. His companion, a woman who looked uncomfortable but not entirely aware, shifted in her seat. The moment seemed to hang in the air, everyone around them unsure whether to join in or pretend it hadn't happened. Harlan's heart skipped a beat. He could feel his chest tighten, the muscles in his jaw stiffening. No, he thought. Not again, not here. His feet began to move, but just as quickly they stopped. His eyes returned to his son, still unsure but undeterred. Clara's hand still rested in his, and Haimey's face, pale with concentration, was focused only on her, not on the eyes around them. For a fleeting second, Harlan was overcome by an overwhelming urge to pull Haimey away. He wanted to march, over to that man, to say something, to do something, anything to protect his son from the laughter, from the stares. But something else, something deeper, stopped him. Haimey's foot shuffled forward, and for a brief, beautiful moment his movement was more than a step. It was defiance. It was courage. It was him choosing not to let the world's harshness control him. And for the first time, Harlan didn't want to take that away. The tension in Harlan's chest tightened further, and then, as if on cue, Clara turned her head slightly, her eyes locking with his. There was no judgment in her gaze, no pity, just a quiet understanding. She hadn't looked at Harlan the entire time they had been moving, but now, for the first time, she acknowledged his presence. It was as if she knew what he was thinking, knew the battle raging inside of him. And yet her gaze didn't waver. She didn't offer a word of comfort. She didn't ask for his approval. She just kept her focus on Haimey, trusting him to lead. The weight of that single, simple glance shattered something inside of Harlan. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He's not leading because he needs me to protect him. He's leading because he wants to. And Clara wasn't just following him. She was allowing him to lead her, to lead them all, into something unfamiliar, something unknown, and yet somehow, something profoundly beautiful. Harlan felt the lump in his throat. Grow! His hands clenched at his sides as he stood there, paralyzed, torn between the protective instinct that had been his for so long, and the realization that maybe, just maybe, he had been holding Haimey back for too long. The moment stretched longer. The laughter from the other table faded into the background, replaced by the soft, hesitant movements of Haimey and Clara. The music, once a distant hum, now seemed to swell around them. It was the slow rhythm of a waltz, its notes fragile like the tension in the room but steady enough to carry them through. Haimey took another step, unsure, his feet dragging slightly. Clara's hand, warm and steady, didn't pull him into line. It didn't rush him. It simply let him find his own pace. Harlan couldn't look away. The entire room seemed to fade into the background as he watched his son take another step, and then another, each one a little more certain, each one a little more courageous. He looked around the room. The guests had gone silent. Some still watched with curiosity, others with uncertainty. But no one moved. It was as if everyone had forgotten to breathe, caught in the quiet drama unfolding before them. Harlan could feel their eyes on him. They were all waiting for him to do something, to stop it, to protect Haimey from making a fool of himself. But this wasn't about him. It wasn't about protecting Haimey. It was about letting Haimey have his moment, and for the first time, Harlan realized that his son didn't need him to protect him. He needed him to step back and let him take the lead. The thought was both terrifying and liberating. Harlan had spent so much of his life building walls to protect his son from the world's cruelty, from failure, from humiliation. But now, as he watched Haimey, his son, the boy he had shielded from everything, take the lead, Harlan knew that it was time for those walls to come down. Haimey wasn't just standing anymore. He wasn't just surviving. He was living, he was taking risks. He was trusting himself, and as Harlan stood there, rooted to the spot, he realized that the hardest part wasn't about letting Haimey fall. The hardest part was letting him rise, letting him choose his own path, even if it meant stumbling along the way. In the silence that filled the room, Harlan made his decision. He wouldn't step in. He wouldn't shield his son from the world anymore. Not tonight. Tonight, he would. Let Haimey lead. And for the first time, Harlan felt the weight of his own protection lift, replaced by something much heavier. Pride. As the music played on, the room remained still, held captive by the delicate, unspoken connection between Haimey and Clara. With each shaky step Haimey took, Harlan felt his heart shift. The walls he had spent so many years building, those walls of protection, control, and fear, slowly began to crumble. For the first time in years, he wasn't trying to shield his son from the world. He was watching Haimey step into it on his own terms. And with that, something inside Harlan unlocked. TT, laughter from earlier had faded, replaced by a sense of quiet reverence. No one laughed anymore. Instead, they watched, a small boy with uncertain feet leading a woman with grace and trust. No one had expected this. No one had expected Haimey to stand up, to move, to lead. But here he was, doing it anyway. And in the process, he was teaching the room, teaching all of them, something far more powerful than any dance step could convey. The other diners, once skeptical or uncomfortable, had begun to watch with something more than just curiosity. There was something in the way Clara moved with Haimey that spoke louder than any words could. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It wasn't flawless, but it was genuine. And it was that authenticity, those small, trembling steps that made it so profound. Haimey wasn't just dancing. He was declaring, in his own quiet way, that he would not be defined by his limitations. He wasn't waiting for someone to tell him he was good enough. He was stepping forward, uncertain but determined, into a world that had always seemed too harsh, too unforgiving. And Clara wasn't just following. She was trusting. She was allowing herself to be led by a boy who had long been underestimated. Together they created something powerful, something more than just a dance. They created a moment of true connection. As the song came to an end, Haimey paused, standing still for a moment, breathless but proud. Clara smiled gently at him. Her eyes filled with warmth, and without a word she gave his hand a soft squeeze. Haimey looked up at her, his face flushed with a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. "Is it okay?" he asked quietly, his voice barely more than a breath. Clara nodded. "It's perfect," she said, her voice steady and kind. And for a brief moment, Haimey believed her. In that small exchange, something inside him shifted. A tiny crack in the shell he had built around himself. He wasn't broken, he wasn't incomplete. He was exactly where he needed to be. The room slowly came back to life, the murmurs of conversation rising again. But this time it was different. People weren't just talking, they were reflecting. Harlan, standing at the edge of the room, felt his own heart beat with a rhythm he hadn't known he'd been missing. He had watched his son take the lead, not because he was perfect, but because he was brave. And in that moment, Harlan realized something he hadn't allowed himself to understand for years. Haimey didn't need to be protected. He needed to be trusted. The weight of Harlan's realizations settled heavily on his chest. He had spent so long keeping Haimey safe, but in doing so, he had stifled his son's ability to step into the world and truly live. Tonight, Haimey had shown him the way. It wasn't about shielding him from failure. It was about giving him the space to fall and the opportunity to rise again. For the first time, Harlan understood that being a parent wasn't about holding onto your child's hand so tightly they couldn't move. It was about letting go, just enough, so they could find their own way. As the night wore on, Harlan found himself lost in thought, replaying the moment in his mind. But it was no longer one of regret. It was one of pride. He was proud of his son for daring to take that step. Proud of Haimey for trusting himself enough to lead, even when the path was uncertain. And he was proud of himself, too, for finally letting go, for finally seeing Haimey for who he truly was. A boy, yes, but a boy with the strength to face the world, no matter how uneven the ground beneath him might be. The drive home was quiet, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The silence between Harlan and Haimey was no longer filled with tension. It was filled with understanding. Haimey, sitting in the passenger seat, stared out the window, the city lights blurring as they passed. He didn't speak, but Harlan could feel the change in him. There was a new confidence in his stillness, a quiet pride in the way he held himself. When they arrived home, Haimey unbuckled his seatbelt slowly, and as he stepped out of the car, he turned to Harlan with a small but meaningful smile. "Dad," he said, his voice soft but sure, "I don't need you to hold my hand so much anymore." Harlan's heart skipped. He didn't know how to respond, so he simply nodded, letting the moment hang between them. Haimey wasn't asking for permission. He wasn't seeking approval. He was simply stating the truth. For so long, Harlan had held on too tightly, but Haimey had finally shown him that it was time to step back. The next morning, Harlan made a decision. He would not hold Haimey back, not anymore. Haimey had led the way, and for the first time, Harlan felt it was time for him to follow, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. As they stood together in the kitchen, Harlan placed his hand gently on Haimey's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had just begun. And in that moment, Harlan knew that the most important step wasn't the one Haimey had taken on the dance floor. It was the one they would take together from here on out. The journey of trusting each other, of letting go, and of moving forward, one step at a time.